The space station floated at the edge of neutral territory where no empire held power. It was a place for talking, for making deals, and for species who did not trust each other to meet without weapons. Today it hosted the Galactic Trade Summit, and representatives from 30 different civilizations filled its massive halls. Commander stood near the viewing window and watched the human shuttle dock. She was tall even by standards, nearly 7 feet of violet scales and lean muscle. Her claws were filed to ceremonial points, and her yellow eyes missed nothing. She had killed enemies on 12 different worlds and led armies that conquered entire star systems. She was considered one of the finest warriors her empire had ever produced. The humans amused her. They had joined the galactic community only 40 years ago, a blink of an eye compared to civilizations that measured their histories in hundreds of thousands of years. Their technology was adequate but unremarkable. Their military was small. Their bodies were soft and fragile, lacking claws or scales or venom or any of the natural weapons that most species possessed. Yet they insisted on attending these summits as if they belonged among the great powers. Second in command, a younger named, joined her at the window. He asked her why she was watching the lesser species. She told him that she found them curious, like insects that did not know their place in the order of things. The human delegation entered the main hall an hour later. There were only 5 of them. The leader was a woman in her 50s named Helen Price, their ambassador to the galactic community. She had gray hair and sharp eyes and walked with the confidence of someone who had survived many difficult negotiations. Behind her came 2 advisors carrying data tablets, a communications officer and one other. His attention fixed on this last human. He was male, somewhere in his 30s, with brown hair that was neither short nor long and gray eyes that seemed to look at everything while revealing nothing. He wore simple clothes in dark colors, and he moved with an economy of motion that recognized. She had seen it in warriors, that careful awareness of the body and its relationship to space. But what truly caught her attention was the weapon at his hip. It was a blade, curved and elegant, housed in a simple sheath. In an age of plasma weapons and molecular disruptors, this human carried a sword. She laughed, and several nearby delegates turned to look at her. She did not care. The idea of a human with a primitive blade was the most entertaining thing she had seen in months. The summit proceeded as such things always did. Representatives argued over mining rights and trade routes, and the countless small disputes that arose when different species tried to share a galaxy. The Empire wanted exclusive access to a newly discovered asteroid field rich in rare metals. The Collective opposed them. The Crystalline abstained from most discussions, as was their way. And the humans quietly supported whatever position seemed most fair, earning them no friends and no enemies. Found herself watching the human with the sword. She learned his name was, and he served as the ambassador's personal bodyguard. The idea was almost offensive. This soft creature was supposed to protect someone from harm. He would not last 3 seconds against a child in a training match. On the 3rd day of the summit, the dispute over mining rights reached a breaking point. The accused of already sending ships to the asteroid field in violation of neutral territory agreements. High Commander, the leader of the delegation, the accusation but did so with the smug expression of someone who knew he could not be stopped. Ambassador Helen Price stood and spoke calmly. She suggested that both parties submit to independent verification of their ship movements. It was a reasonable proposal. It was also exactly the kind of proposal that made them look guilty if they refused. Scales darkened with anger. He turned to the human ambassador and asked her if she thought the Empire needed permission from lesser species to act. Helen Price replied that she thought all species benefited from following agreed-upon rules. The hall went silent. Speaking to a high commander in such a way was either very brave or very foolish. Stepped toward the human delegation and his claws extended without conscious thought. He declared that if the humans wished to challenge honor, they could do so properly, through the ancient rite of. Felt a thrill run through her. Was ceremonial combat, a tradition so old that even species who hated the respected it. A challenge given could not be refused without admitting weakness, and they had never lost a duel in 3,000 years. Helen Price's face remained calm, but her advisors looked afraid. They whispered urgently to each other. One of them shook his head repeatedly, but before the ambassador could respond, stepped forward. He spoke for the first time since arriving at the station. His voice was quiet but clear. He accepted the challenge on behalf of the human delegation. Laughed, and many in the hall laughed with him. The representative covered her face in what might have been embarrassment for the humans. That made a sound like breaking glass, their version of surprise. Did not laugh. She was studying eyes and she saw something there she had not expected. Not fear, not desperation, something else, something she could not name. Declared that would serve as the champion. It was an insult wrapped in an honor. Sending their finest warrior against a human bodyguard suggested that they did not even need to choose carefully. Any could defeat any human. Stepped forward and looked down at. She was almost 2 feet taller than him. Her claws could cut through ship armor. Her scales could deflect most projectile weapons. She had trained in combat since she could walk. He looked up at her with those gray eyes and showed no expression at all. The duel would take place the following morning in the station's ceremonial arena. Weapons were the choice of each combatant. Would use her natural claws, blessed by priests and hardened through ritual. Presumably, would use his primitive sword. As the delegations dispersed to prepare, Ambassador Helen Price pulled aside. Watched from across the hall. The ambassador spoke urgently, and her concern was obvious even from a distance. Replied with a few quiet words and then did something that found strange. He smiled. It was not the smile of someone being brave in the face of certain death. It was not forced or false. It was the smile of someone who knew something that no one else in the room understood. That night sharpened her claws and meditated on victory. She thought about how quickly she would end the match, whether to humiliate the human slowly or simply kill him fast. She decided on slow. The galaxy needed to see what happened to those who challenged the. She never once considered that she might lose. In his quarters on the other side of the station, sat alone with his sword across his knees. The blade was old, much older than anyone watching would have guessed. It had been passed down through 7 generations of his family, and each generation had added their knowledge to its use. He ran his fingers along the flat of the blade and remembered his grandmother teaching him the first forms when he was 6 years old. Tomorrow he would face a creature stronger and faster than any human. Tomorrow he would show the galaxy something it had forgotten. Humans had been fighting things stronger than themselves since the beginning. They had never stopped learning how. The ceremonial arena was built into the heart of station, a circular space surrounded by rising seats that could hold thousands of spectators. Today, every seat was filled. Word had spread quickly through the station that a human had accepted a challenge, and species from every delegation had come to watch what everyone assumed would be a quick and brutal lesson. Entered from the eastern gate, and in the crowd roared their approval. She wore no armor, trusting her natural scales to protect her. Her claws gleamed under the arena lights, each one as long as a human hand and sharp enough to cut through bone. She raised her arms to acknowledge her supporters, and then turned her yellow eyes toward the western gate. Walked into the arena alone. He wore simple dark clothing that allowed easy movement. His feet were bare, something that made several aliens murmur in confusion. The curved sword was in his right hand, already drawn, the blade catching light as he moved. He did not look at the crowd. He did not acknowledge the scattered laughter from those who expected easy entertainment. His gray eyes were fixed on and nothing else. The ceremonial master, an ancient whose crystal body had turned gray with age, spoke the traditional words. Was sacred combat. It would continue until one fighter could not stand or yielded or died. There were no other rules. Both fighters indicated their understanding, and For a long moment, neither fighter moved. Studied the human with new attention. His stance was unusual, weight balanced evenly, the sword held low and to the side rather than raised defensively. His breathing was slow and controlled. His bare feet gripped the arena floor. There was no tension in his body, no sign of the fear that she had expected to see. She decided to end this quickly. Attacked with the speed that made warriors feared across the galaxy. She crossed the distance between them in less than a second, her right claw sweeping toward his throat in a killing stroke. She had ended fights with this same move dozens of times. Her claw cut through empty air. Was no longer where he had been. He had moved, not backward but to the side and slightly forward, slipping past her strike like water flowing around a stone. His blade traced a line in the air, but he did not attack. He simply repositioned and returned to his ready stance. The crowd went quiet. Felt something she had not experienced in many years. Confusion. She had watched recordings of human movement. She knew their physical limitations. They were slower than, weaker, less durable in every way. Yet this human had avoided her fastest attack as if he had known it was coming before she launched it. She attacked again, this time with a combination of strikes that she had used in actual combat against armed opponents. Right claw, left claw, spinning kick, right claw again. Each attack was fast enough to blur in the vision of most species. Avoided them all. He did not block, he did not parry, he simply was not where her attacks landed. His movement was continuous, a flowing dance that kept him always one step ahead of her claws. Once or twice his blade touched her arms or legs, light taps that could have been cuts if he had applied pressure. But he did not cut. He was showing her something. 3 minutes passed. 5 minutes. Was breathing harder now, which should not have been possible. Could fight for hours without tiring. But she was expending enormous energy on attacks that hit nothing, while the human seemed to grow calmer with each exchange. Spoke for the first time since the duel began. His voice was steady, almost conversational. He told her that humans had been fighting predators since before they learned to make fire. They were smaller and weaker than the things that hunted them, so they learned to watch. They learned to read the tiny movements that came before an attack. They learned that strength meant nothing if it could not connect. Snarled and abandoned the ceremonial restraint she had been observing. She attacked with full killing intent, no longer trying to humiliate but simply trying to hit him, to prove that he could be touched, that he was not some ghost wearing human skin. Shifted his stance. It was a small change, a slight lowering of his center, a new angle to his sword, but everything else changed with it. He was no longer purely defensive. His blade moved. Felt a line of fire across her left forearm. She jumped back and looked down to see violet blood welling from a cut that ran from her wrist to her elbow. The wound was not deep, but it was real. First blood had been drawn. She had never been cut in a duel before, never once in over 100 matches. The crowd was completely silent. Even the head stopped cheering. Everyone was staring at the thin line of blood dripping from his arm onto the arena floor. Returned to his ready stance and waited. His breathing was slightly faster now and sweat gleamed on his forehead. He was working hard. He was human, and facing was pushing his body to its limits. But his eyes remained calm and his sword remained steady. Understood something in that moment. She had been wrong about this human from the beginning. She had seen his small body and soft skin and assumed weakness. She had seen his primitive weapon and assumed foolishness. She had never considered that humans might have survived not despite their weaknesses, but because of them. When you are weaker than everything that wants to kill you, you learn to fight differently. You learn patience. You learn to study your enemies until you know them better than they know themselves. You learn that the first strike matters less than the last one. This human had been watching her for 3 days. He had studied how she moved, how she stood, how her weight shifted before each attack. He had probably studied recordings of combat for years before coming to the station. He had prepared for this moment with the dedication of a species that could not afford to lose. And now she understood the look she had seen in his eyes the night before. It was not confidence or arrogance. It was knowledge. He knew something about her that she had not known about herself. He knew how to beat her. Made a decision that would have shocked anyone who knew her. She did not attack. Instead, she spoke. She asked him how long he had been preparing for this fight. Considered the question. Then he told her that he had been training with the sword since he was 6 years old. He had been studying combat techniques for 15 years. He had been waiting for an opportunity like this for longer than he cared to remember. 23 years of preparation for a single fight. An entire human lifetime dedicated to proving something that the galaxy did not believe. Felt something unexpected. Not anger or shame, though those were present. She felt respect. This human had done what no other species had bothered to do. He had taken this seriously enough to truly prepare. The duel was not over, but standing there with her blood on the arena floor, realized that she had already lost something more important than the match. She had lost her certainty. For the first time in her life, she did not know how this fight would end. She raised her claws and prepared to continue. The human raised his sword. Around them, the galaxy held its breath. Whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same. The blood on his arm had already begun to slow. Healed quickly, one of the many advantages their species possessed. But the wound itself was not the problem. The problem was what the wound represented. She had been cut by a human. The arena remained silent as circled her opponent. Moved with her, maintaining the distance between them, his bare feet making no sound on the polished floor. His sword stayed low, that strange guard position that seemed to leave him open but somehow never did. Tried a different approach. She feinted left and struck right, a technique that had fooled warriors from a dozen species. Did not react to the feint. His eyes stayed fixed on her center of mass, reading the truth of her movement rather than the lie of her deception. She understood now. He was not faster than her. No human could be. But he was starting to move before she finished deciding what to do. He was reading her intentions in the tiny shifts of her weight, the angle of her shoulders, the direction of her gaze. He had turned her own body into a betrayer. Attacked. It was the first true offensive move he had made, and it caught her off guard. His blade came up in a rising arc that she barely deflected with her left claw. The impact jarred her arm, more force than she had expected from a human. Before she could counter, he had already withdrawn, sliding back to a safe distance. He spoke again, still in that calm voice that was starting to irritate her. He told her about something called heirloom, the name his family gave to their sword style. It had been developed on Earth during an age when humans fought wars with blades instead of machines. His ancestors had faced enemies on horseback, enemies in armor, enemies who were stronger and faster and better equipped. They had won anyway. Attacked with renewed fury. She was faster than him, she knew she was, and if she could just connect once, her claws would end this. But every strike missed by inches. Every killing blow found only air. And every time she overextended, his blade was there, kissing her scales with cuts that stung more than they harmed. She was bleeding from 4 places now. None of the wounds were serious. All of them were humiliating. In the stands, Ambassador Helen Price watched with an expression that mixed pride with fear. A representative leaned toward her and asked where the humans had found such a warrior. Helen explained that had been a history teacher before joining the diplomatic corps. He taught ancient combat arts at a small school in a place called Vermont. On Earth, millions of humans practiced these old fighting styles, keeping traditions alive for reasons they could not always explain. They stared at her. She asked if Helen was saying that this was normal for humans, that they all trained to fight with ancient weapons. Helen shook her head. Not all of them, she said, but enough. Humans remembered their past in ways that other species found strange. They practiced old skills even when those skills seemed useless, and sometimes in moments like this, those forgotten abilities turned out to matter. In the arena had stopped attacking. She stood with her arms at her sides, breathing hard, violet blood dripping from wounds on her arms and legs and one shallow cut across her cheek. Stood across from her, his sword still ready, waiting for her next move. She asked him why he had not killed her yet. He was clearly capable of it. His blade had touched her a dozen times in places where a deeper cut would have ended the fight permanently. Considered the question. Then he told her that killing was not the purpose. He was not here for blood. He was here to demonstrate something that the galaxy had forgotten. Asked what that was. Humans, he said, did not measure strength the way other species did. They did not care about size or speed or natural weapons. They measured strength by what someone was willing to endure, willing to sacrifice, willing to learn. A human who trained for 20 years to master a single skill was stronger than any natural advantage. Will was stronger than biology. Felt something shift inside her. It was uncomfortable, like a bone that had healed wrong being broken again so it could set properly. She had believed things about humans that this fight was proving false. She had believed things about strength that this human was dismantling with every word. She attacked one final time. It was her best effort, every technique she knew combined into a sequence that should have been impossible to avoid. Her claws blurred through the air in patterns that had killed enemies for 3,000 years of history. Met her attack with his own. His blade moved in ways that should not have been possible for a human body. Each strike was redirected. Each claw that reached for him found only steel. And then, in a moment that seemed to last forever and no time at all, he stepped inside her guard. His empty left hand pressed against her chest. His right hand brought the sword around in a spinning arc that ended with the blade at her throat. His eyes looked up into hers from less than a foot away. She could not move without cutting her own neck open. The arena erupted. Aliens of every species were on their feet, making sounds that ranged from screams to crystalline singing to deep rumbles that shook the stands. Sat in stunned silence. The ceremonial master drifted forward, preparing to declare the match. But did not wait for the declaration. He lowered his blade and stepped back. Then he extended his empty hand toward. She stared at the offered hand. In culture, accepting help from an enemy was the greatest shame imaginable. It meant admitting that you could not stand on your own. It meant accepting that you had been completely and utterly defeated. Spoke quietly just for her. He told her that humans did not seek enemies. They had enough of those on their own world. What they wanted was understanding. He offered his hand not to shame her but to lift her up. Reached out and took his hand. The sound from the crowd changed, becoming something more complex, more confused. No one knew how to react. A warrior had just accepted help from a human. Nothing like this had ever happened in galactic history. Helped her to her feet. They stood facing each other in the center of the arena, human, and something new existed between them. Not friendship, not yet, but the beginning of respect. The galaxy would never look at humans the same way again. The aftermath of the duel spread through station like a shockwave. Within an hour, recordings of the fight had been transmitted to every corner of the galaxy. Within a day, it was the most watched event in the history of the Galactic Information Network. A human had defeated a champion in sacred combat. Nothing would be the same. High Commander stood in his private quarters and watched the recording for the 15th time. His scales had gone pale with fury, a dangerous sign that his aides recognized and feared. He froze the image at the moment whence blade rested against throat and stared at it until his eyes burned. 3,000 years. 3,000 years of supremacy in ceremonial combat. 3,000 years of using to intimidate lesser species into compliance. And now a human, a creature that should not have been able to lift a training weight, had broken that record with a piece of sharpened metal. Summoned his advisors and demanded explanations. They had none. The human had used no hidden technology. Medical scans confirmed he was completely baseline, no genetic modifications or cybernetic enhancements. He had simply been better than. That was impossible. That could not be allowed to stand. Called an emergency session of the summit delegates. He stood before them and declared that the duel had been illegitimate. The human had clearly used some unknown form of cheating. He demanded a rematch under stricter conditions. Ambassador Helen Price rose to respond. She kept her voice calm and professional, but there was a new confidence in her bearing. She pointed out that herself had accepted its hand after the fight, acknowledging her defeat according to tradition. Was the High Commander saying that his own warrior was wrong? Scales went even paler. He was trapped by his own customs. If he sought acknowledgment, he insulted her honor. If he accepted it, he admitted that a human had beaten her fairly. Spoke from his seat behind the ambassador. He offered a simple solution. If the wanted another duel, he would accept. They could examine him with any technology they wished. They could choose any champion they wanted. He would face them with nothing but his sword and his training. The hall went quiet, should have accepted immediately. It was exactly what he wanted. But something in his voice gave him pause. The human had already proven himself capable of defeating one of the finest warriors. What if he could do it again? Entered the hall. She had refused medical treatment, and her wounds were still visible, scabbed over but not healed. She walked directly to the speaker's platform and stood facing. She told him that she had fought the human fairly and lost fairly. His skill was genuine. His victory was legitimate. If this, he insulted not just her but the entire tradition of. He made their sacred combat into a joke that only mattered when the one. Stared at her with something approaching hatred. She was one of his best warriors, and she was publicly contradicting him. The damage to his authority was almost worse than the original defeat. The representative stood and added her voice. Her species had been rivals of the four. She declared that they recognized the human victory and offered their congratulations to the human delegation. Furthermore, she proposed a military alliance between the collective and humanity. Other species began to speak. The offered technology exchanges. The wanted cultural ambassadors. A species so shy they rarely spoke at all, suggested trade agreements. One by one, the delegations that had ignored humanity for decades suddenly found reasons to become friends. Watched his empire's influence crumbling in real time. He had called for the duel to humiliate the humans. Instead, he had given them the greatest diplomatic victory in their short galactic history. He from the summit without another word. His shuttle departed within the hour, and the remaining delegation was left without leadership. After the session, found in one of the station's observation decks, He was sitting alone, watching the stars, his sword resting across his knees. She approached and stood beside him, unsure of what to say. He spoke first. He told her that he had studied her species for most of his adult life. He had watched thousands of hours of combat. He had learned their history, their philosophy, their codes of honor. He had come to respect them deeply, even as he prepared to fight them. Asked him why. Why spend a lifetime studying an alien species? Was quiet for a moment. Then he explained that humans had a saying, "If you want peace, prepare for war." But the deeper wisdom was this: if you want to truly defeat an enemy, you must first understand them well enough that they could become your friend. She did not fully understand, but she felt the truth in his words. She asked him to teach her. She wanted to know how a human fought. She wanted to understand the philosophy that had produced a warrior capable of defeating her. Looked up at her with surprise. No had ever asked to learn from another species. They believed they had nothing to learn, but had felt his blade at her throat, and she knew now that belief had been wrong. He agreed to teach her. Over the following weeks, while diplomats negotiated treaties and trade agreements, and met in a training room deep in the station, he showed her the basics of human sword forms, the stances and movements that seemed so simple until you tried to execute them perfectly. She showed him techniques in return, though she was learning more than she taught. They talked while they trained. She asked about Earth, about human history, about the millions of conflicts that had shaped his species. He asked about the Empire, about the weight of 3,000 years of tradition, about what it meant to grow up believing your people were the strongest in the galaxy. They discovered that they were not so different. Both of them had spent their lives training to fight. Both of them had dedicated themselves to martial excellence. Both of them had believed things about the galaxy that were now being proven incomplete. One evening, told that he had done more than defeat her in a duel. He had changed how she saw the universe. She had grown up believing that strength came from the body, from natural gifts, from being born better than other species. He had shown her that strength could be built, earned, chosen. Told her that humans had always believed this. They had too. They were not the strongest or the fastest or the most durable species on their own planet. They had survived only by refusing to accept that weakness was permanent. The galaxy was changing around them. The Empire was facing questions it had never faced before. Younger were watching the recordings of the duel and asking why they could not learn from other species too. The hierarchy that had held power for thousands of years was starting to crack. And at the center of it all, a human teacher and a warrior trained together, building something new. 6 months had passed since the duel that changed everything. Station had been transformed from a place of suspicious negotiations into something new. Species that had avoided each other for centuries now shared meals and ideas. Trade delegations that once met in guarded silence now laughed together in open halls. The old hierarchies were not gone, but they were shifting, making room for something different. Stood in a training room that had become famous across the galaxy. 12 students from 8 different species practiced the basic forms he had taught them. A with 4 arms struggled to adapt human sword techniques to her body. A young, barely old enough to leave his, worked through the footwork patterns with intense concentration. A crystalline moved in ways that should have been impossible for a being made of living stone. Watched from the doorway. She had become his primary assistant, translating his teachings for species that did not share human ways of thinking. She had also become something that surprised everyone who knew her history. She had become his friend. The galaxy still had trouble accepting this. A commander and a human bodyguard working together as equals. It broke rules that everyone had assumed were permanent. But the rules were changing and had decided to change with them. After the training session ended and walked together through the station's main concourse, aliens of every type recognized them and nodded in respect. Some still watched with suspicion, unable to believe that a human had honestly defeated a champion. Others watched with something like pity, thinking she had been shamed beyond recovery. Neither of them cared about the opinions of those who did not understand. They stopped at a viewing platform that looked out over the asteroid field that had started everything. The mining dispute had been resolved months ago. The field was now shared between 5 different species, a compromise that would have been impossible before the duel. Spoke quietly. She told that her people were struggling. The younger generations wanted change, wanted to learn from other species the way she had learned from him. But the older warriors, the ones who remembered the centuries of supremacy, resisted. They said that accepting help from lesser species was the beginning of the end. Asked her what she believed. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said that she believed they had become stagnant. They were so certain of their own strength that they had stopped growing. They had not invented a new combat technique in 500 years. They had not formed a genuine alliance with another species in twice that long. They were still powerful, but they were slowly dying, frozen in traditions that no longer served them. He had shown her another way. Humans grew because they had to. They adapted because they could not survive otherwise. They learned from everyone because they could not afford the arrogance of thinking they knew everything. She wanted her people to learn this lesson before it was too late. Told her that change was slow. It took generations for a species to truly transform. But every journey started with a single step, and she had already taken that step. Others would follow. Later that day, Ambassador Helen Price addressed the Galactic Council in its formal chamber. Dozens of species had sent representatives, the largest gathering in decades. She presented something she called the Human Doctrine, a proposal for a new kind of interstellar cooperation. The doctrine was simple. Any species willing to learn from others, willing to set aside the belief that they were superior, could join a coalition based on mutual respect. There would be no hierarchy in this coalition. No species would be considered greater or lesser. Knowledge would be shared freely. Conflicts would be resolved through discussion rather than domination. Many of the older empires laughed. The representative, a replacement for the disgraced, called it naive and childish. They declared that strength was the only true currency in the galaxy and always would be. But when Helen asked which species would join the coalition, hands and claws and tentacles rose throughout the chamber. 37 species pledged their support that day. Most were smaller powers, species that had lived under the shadow of empires for too long. But among them was one surprise. Stood and declared that she spoke for herself, not for the empire. She had no authority to commit her people to anything, but she would join the human coalition as an individual. She would work to show others that there was strength in openness, in learning, in admitting that they did not have all the answers. Her words sent shockwaves through the contingent. A commander of her status, publicly breaking with imperial policy. It was unprecedented. It was nearly treason. But she did not care. She had seen the truth in a human's eyes, felt it at the edge of his blade. The old ways were ending whether they accepted it or not. 1 year later, on the anniversary of the duel, a ceremony was held in the arena where it had taken place, and stood together at the center while representatives from over 100 species filled the seats around them. An elder spoke the ceremonial words. They were gathered to honor not a victory but a beginning. What had started as a challenge between two warriors had become a movement that was reshaping the galaxy. The human doctrine had grown beyond anything its creators had imagined. Species that had been enemies for were talking, trading, teaching each other. The elder asked to speak. She looked out at the gathered crowd, at the impossible mixture of beings who had come together, because a human had refused to accept that he was weak. She said that she had spent her whole life believing certain things about strength and power and the natural order of species. She had believed that they were at the top of that order because they had earned it. She had been wrong. Strength, she now understood, was not about being born better than others. It was about what you chose to do with what you had. Humans were small and soft and fragile, but they had chosen to be strong anyway. They had trained their bodies and minds for thousands of years, preparing for challenges they could not predict. When the moment came, they were ready. She said that he had beaten her with a blade, but the real victory was what came after. He had offered his hand instead of taking her life. He had treated her like an equal when everyone else saw her as defeated. He had shown her that the greatest strength was not the ability to destroy your enemies, but the wisdom to turn them into friends. Stepped forward to speak. He kept his words simple, as he always did. He said that humans had a long history of underestimating themselves. They looked at the galaxy and saw species that were bigger, faster, stronger in every way that mattered. They assumed they would always be at the bottom of the hierarchy. But they had forgotten their own history. They had forgotten the centuries of fighting against predators and enemies and even each other. They had forgotten that they had survived everything their world could throw at them and come out stronger. He had not beaten because he was better than her. He had beaten her because his ancestors had passed down their knowledge, generation after generation, preparing him for a moment that none of them would ever see. He was not strong because of what he was. He was strong because of what they had given him. That was the gift humans could offer the galaxy, not technology or military power, but the understanding that strength could be built, shared, passed down through time. No species had to be weak forever. No hierarchy was permanent. The ceremony ended with and standing side by side, looking out at a galaxy that had begun to believe something new. The old powers still existed. The old conflicts still simmered. Change would take generations to complete. But it had started. A human with a sword had shown the galaxy that the order of things could be reshaped. And standing beside him, a warrior had proven that anyone could choose to change. They had both been considered weak at different moments. They had both been wrong about each other. And in that mutual misunderstanding, they had found the beginning of something greater than either of them could have built alone. The stars waited outside the station's windows. The future was uncertain. But for the first time in galactic history, it belonged to everyone who was brave enough to claim it.